Shalom. Welcome to Light to the Nations. We've been talking about building the temple, and essentially, I'd like to think that we're ready to build the temple. Some people think that we have to wait for Messiah to come, Mashiach, to tell us that it's time to build the temple, or for he himself to build the temple. Some people believe that the temple is going to be something supernatural, that it's going to come about in a manner that is not really within the confines of what normally happens in this world. And these are some of the things that we've started to talk about now at the conclusion of our study on Rambam's Hilchot Beit HaBeChira. Maimonides, a realist, very, very solid, very, very logical, and certainly gave us the whole array of halachot, of all the laws pertaining to the building of the temple, as he recorded so dutifully, as he distilled from the oral tradition. So we've begun to tackle, in some earnest, the whole conundrum of the relationship, if there is one, between the concept of the Holy Temple and the coming of the Messiah. And just to backtrack very briefly, because we've been covering so much ground and there's so many details, a little bit of a review. Again, the Rambam makes it very clear in the beginning of Hilchot Beit HaBeChira, as we learned, Vasuli Mikdash V'Shachanti B'Tocham, the verse from Exodus 25:8 instructs us that the mitzvah, the commandment to build the temple, is eternal, and indeed, that's the very definition of a commandment, that it applies all the time. And then we began to talk about the whole concept of who Mashiach is, and what he is. And of course, we don't want to ever, in any way seem to be diminishing from either, God forbid, the expectation or the importance of that figure. But one of the most important things that has to be done in general, in a forum like this, in my opinion, is to demystify the concept of Mashiach. Because there's too much nebulous, murky, just kind of shadowy doubt about so many things that has crept into our whole world outlook from different influences and from different circumstances that have been part and parcel of our experience. But when we really study the classic texts of Judaism, and when we really study the history of the Jewish people and the important sources, we begin to understand that the whole concept of Mashiach was never meant to be a mystical concept. He's a man, and he is a great man. But he's a physical, flesh and blood king, and he may possess qualities that could be described as practically superhuman, just as much as whenever we really want to laud someone who we feel is head and shoulders above the common man, and who we feel is really something marked for glory and greatness, and is really a cut above everyone else, we might say that person is a superman. But that's the only way that, in that context, that such a statement would be true regarding our righteous king that we anticipate, the Messiah. He's a person who has tremendously honed leadership qualities and is the very paragon of purity and righteousness, but he's a human being. And so we shouldn't ascribe to him things that we can't do or accomplish ourselves and assume that he's going to take care of it because he's something that we're not, because that's not really the Jewish tradition. And so one of the things that we began to discuss is that the great Rabbi Akiva, and we talked about how he really, Rabbi Akiva, is the symbol of the wisdom, the knowledge, and the righteousness of the sages of the Second Temple period, to the extent that on a spiritual level it's recorded that there even exists some sort of spiritual relationship between Rabbi Akiva and Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses himself. Rabbi Akiva, nevertheless, and many of his colleagues, made a case of mistaken identity. They looked at Bar Kochva, the great hero of the uprising against Rome, who sought with all of his might to rebuild the temple and to resume the divine service. Rabbi Akiva thought that Bar Kochva was Mashiach because he exhibited messianic qualities. And it was proven that he was dead wrong. And indeed, our sages tell us that Bar Kokhba's Achilles' heel was his own pride and ego and other midot, attributes that were not so metukan, they were not so well polished and fixed. But Rabbi Akiva, for a long time, was the most ardent supporter of Bar Kokhba. And my point being that Rabbi Akiva apparently was not anticipating he was not anticipating a figure who was only a Torah scholar, who was only steeped in righteousness, who only had a certain atmosphere of holiness, because Bar Kokhba was not really those things. He was a military leader who, with tremendous bravery and tremendous strength and courage, was willing to fight for all of Israel and to sanctify Hashem's name and right all the wrongs that had been done to Israel. And that was good enough for Rabbi Akiva. Then we began to discuss the phenomena of Jewish history being rife with various false messiahs throughout history. And essentially, we began to understand that the Rambam is giving us a recipe for being able to tell what the criteria are for establishing a person as being really, truly, 100% the Mashiach. And again, the Rambam began in the 11th chapter with these words that we were wondering if they're a tremendous contradiction to the beginning of Beit HaBeChira, where he said that it's a positive commandment to build a temple. Here he says, the king, the Messiah, will arise, and he will return the sovereignty of the house of David to its proper place, and he will build the temple and ingather the exiles. But then the Rambam begins to tell us that you shouldn't expect a sign or a wonder from Mashiach when he comes, because after all, Rabbi Akiva thought that Bar Kokhba was Mashiach. And then he uses this language. He says, and if in the future a king will arise from the line of David, who is wise, learned in the Torah, and who performs the commandments as did David, his forefather, according to the written and oral Torah, and he will be able to bring all of Israel to follow the Torah, and he will fight the wars of Hashem, then you can assume that he is the Mashiach. And we use that expression here, Harei ze becheskat Mashiach, becheskat shehu Mashiach. He can be assumed, he is in the category of a really good candidate for being Mashiach. And if he accomplishes all this and succeeds and builds the temple, the Rambam continues, builds the temple in his place and ingathers the exiles, he's definitely Mashiach. And he will fix the whole world, the Rambam says, to serve Hashem together. So he's giving us a prescription here for being able to differentiate between a false Mashiach and the real Mashiach. If he does all this, that shows that he's Mashiach. That doesn't mean that those things can only be done by Mashiach. It means that if they were not done, and someone comes along who seems to be Mashiach, who wants you to think is Mashiach, who we would like to believe is Mashiach, well, if he does these things, then you can bet that it's absolutely him. But there is a precedent in the rabbinic literature for the opposite scenario as well. In fact, that is indeed the decision of the Jerusalem Talmud. We have a statement there where our sages tell us that the building of the temple will precede the coming of the Mashiach. And that's really interesting, actually, because there are a number of traditions that reflect that idea, that the rebuilding of the temple will precede the coming of the Mashiach. Again, the sages of the Jerusalem Talmud tell us this is why the order of our daily prayer in the Shemona Esrei that we're all familiar with, the prayer of the 18 blessings that we say every day. In the order there, if you'll remember, first we say, V'li Yerushalayim Ercha, we say to Hashem, please return to your city Jerusalem, and then we say, Et Tzemach David, will you please bring forth the offspring of David. First, Jerusalem comes first. And there's even a very enigmatic and beautiful midrash that is quite well known and quite famous, and it's in the Yalkut Shimoni collection of midrashic statements. And there it tells us as follows. It says that when the Mashiach arrives, he will stand on the roof of the Holy Temple and he will call out to Israel, humble ones, the time of your redemption has arrived. So according to that midrash, which is only a midrash, the Mashiach comes and stands on the roof of the temple. to make his announcement. So I guess the temple has to be built beforehand in order for him to have something to stand on. That may be a reflection of a verse that we find here in the Torah. It's actually in the book of Malachi, and it is in chapter 3. And it says in the very beginning of that chapter, "Behold, I am sending my messenger, and he will clear a path before me. Suddenly the master whom you seek will come to his sanctuary." That seems again to be indicating that this Adon, as he's called in this verse, the master, will be coming to a sanctuary that is standing. In any event, as we mentioned, the Kesef Mishnah, very important commentary on the Rambam, tells us regarding this chapter that these things are emunot tovot. These are good, strong, healthy beliefs that we should incorporate into our system. Ve'ein li lefaresh bahem davar. And I have nothing further to add, to explain, because these are not halachic matters. These are matters of belief. And that's all interesting, but actually now we turn the page, both literally and figuratively, and we go on to something far more powerful in terms of our understanding of the bad rap that's been pinned onto the Rambam by those who wish to say that based on this section of Hilchot Melachim, chapter 11, that his position indeed is that the Mashiach is supposed to build the temple. Because we don't believe that, that can't be, and I'm going to prove it to you. Prove it to you in several instances, several examples of how that cannot be the Rambam's opinion, but rather it has to be that all the mitzvot of the Torah are for all of Israel to perform, just as he said in Hilchot Beit HaBeChira at the very beginning of our study so long ago, mitzvat aseh lasot bayit l'Hashem. It is a positive commandment to build the house for God. So here's what we have to say today. As we turn the page, literally, into chapter 12 of Hilchot Melachim, the Rambam begins to tell us a little bit about how life is going to be in the time when Mashiach comes. And it's quite interesting, and of course not everyone agrees, but it's hard to find something bad to say about the Rambam, probably the single most important and famous authority of his time. And in terms of the integrity and the power of his statements, none compare to the great Rambam, Maimonides. So he begins to tell us in the beginning of chapter 12, don't ever think, he says, literally in these words, don't ever think that in the days of the Mashiach, anything intrinsic about the way the world works is going to change, or that there's going to be any sort of innovation in the actual fabric of creation. Because, you know, some people actually think that the streets are going to be made of gold, or that trees are going to be, I don't know, with cans of Coca-Cola hanging from them. Here he tells us, Olam keminhago noheg, the world is going to carry on normally. And as far as the verse, for example, in Isaiah, he says that the wolf will lie down with the lamb. He says that is a parable and an allegory. And the fact is that Israel will be at peace with the world and will be free to study the Torah, and everyone in the world will recognize who HaShem truly is. And he goes on to explain different ideas that the sages have told us about the difference between this world and the next world, and he begins to talk to us a little bit about the war of Gog and Magog, and that when is that going to happen, and that before Gog and Magog there'll be a prophet who will come and who will straighten out Israel, referring to Elijah, and that he doesn't come to make something that was already pure impure, or to make something that was impure pure, or anything like that, but rather, as the verse tells us, he comes to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and to place peace in the world. And then he goes and he says, yes, some of the wise men say that before Mashiach comes, Elijah the prophet comes. And then he goes and he says the following amazing thing right here, the other side of the page that we read that so confuses so many people, where he says, well, the Mashiach is going to arise and he's going to rebuild the temple. Till you get down further in the page and you see that he's explaining the difference between a false Mashiach and a real Mashiach. Here the Rambam tells us the following. It's pretty amazing. after telling us all these different ideas and opinions that the sages have about what life is going to be like and what's going to happen, he says, and all of these things, and all of their ilk, he says, actually, no man knows how they're going to happen until they happen, because these things are mysteries, and they're closed by the prophets. They are left deliberately as mysteries. And then he says, even our wise men don't have a particular tradition regarding how these things are going to come about, to fan out, but rather they go according to the interpretation of the various verses. And that's why there are many different opinions regarding these things. In any event, he says, these matters and the order in which they will occur and the details pertaining them are not a mainstay, not a major principle of religion. And a person should never be preoccupied with these kind of things, and should not spend too much time elongating in the study of these midrashim that talk about these things, and not make them into the main thing, because they do not bring a person neither to fear of heaven nor to love of heaven. And a person should not calculate when the end is going to occur. In fact, he quotes the sages as saying that, may the bones of those who calculate the end be blasted. But rather, he says, what's proper Jewish behavior? A person should wait and believe in general, in simple faith in all of these things. So, the amazing thing here, obviously to us, on one side of the same piece of page, the Rambam tells us in the beginning of the 11th chapter, he seems to be telling us Mashiach is going to come, he's going to return the dynasty of David to its proper place, and he's going to rebuild the temple. Then he told us about, Rabbi Akiva's mistake, and he told us about if such and such a person comes and does such and such, he's probably Mashiach. If he comes and does that, he's definitely Mashiach. And then all of a sudden the Rambam tells us, and by the way, nobody really knows what's going to happen until it happens. And this actually is an amazing insight. And then when he continues and tells us that there is he's really foreshadowing here and intimating there is a very big problem that a lot of people have. A lot of people, and we find this so much today in our contemporary society, a lot of people are so obsessed with Mashiach now, Mashiach coming, and what it's going to be like. And, we're commanded to wait. And we learned together as well that if you don't wait, and the Rambam told us this also in the beginning of chapter 11, if you don't wait, then not only do you show contempt for the concept of the Mashiach and the prophets, but you also show contempt for Moshe Rabbeinu and the whole Torah, because it's a main principle of faith that he's going to come, and you're commanded to wait. But that's it. You're supposed to wait, and you're supposed to believe and pray every day that Mashiach should come. But the problem is when people pin everything on Mashiach to take care of everything and fulfill for them, as it were, if this sounds familiar in a bad way, the whole Torah. That's not the Jewish way. No one fulfills the Torah for the individual. We do it, each one of us, for ourselves. And the problem has become now that so many people assume that when Mashiach comes, he's going to take care of so many things that are beyond our intellect. Now, how could we ever do it? So that we have created a different reality now where we've just decided collectively that certain things are just not for us to do in this generation. How could we possibly think of building the temple? What would the geopolitical reality? And people will tell you, people that are still in the diaspora, they'll tell you, how could we possibly consider ever living in Israel? It's so difficult. When Mashiach comes, that's when we're going to live in Israel. How does that work? Here the Rambam is telling us an unbelievable idea. He's telling us something very honest that doesn't in any way detract from the beauty of the structure of the Torah tradition. It doesn't detract in any way from the greatness of who Mashiach is and the faith that he's going to come in Hashem's promise. It doesn't detract from the beauty of all the prophecies that are being fulfilled. And it doesn't detract from the wisdom of the sages. He just tells us, don't let anybody tell you that it's going to be exactly like this or it's going to be exactly like that, like so many people are doing today, like so many people are saying the temple can't be built until he comes, because the Rambam is saying, don't go for that, don't listen to them, because no one can tell you that. And part of that is because of what we learned previously in a previous episode where we were discussing the fact that there are different verses that seem to be contradictory. Is Mashiach's arrival going to be regal, or is it going to be quite low-keyed? Depends on us at that time. Anything can happen. And the Rambam is telling us here very clearly the Jewish tradition is multifaceted. It holds everything. Anything can happen if we make it happen. And so he's telling us there is no one particular truth about how it's going to come down when Mashiach comes. Just wait for it and don't you tell HaShem how it has to be, because that is not the Jewish way. We don't tell HaShem what to do. He tells us what to do. And so it's amazing, in the face of those people who wish to pin upon the Rambam the idea that he says that Mashiach is going to build the temple, where on the very next page, if they would bother reading, he tells us no person knows how these things are going to happen until they happen. But I want to go even further. And I want to quote for you from another amazing source of the Rambam, and that is one of his amazing letters that he wrote, which is in the volume called Igrot HaRambam, the letters of the Rambam, which are various halachic responsa that he wrote for questioners around the world. And this particular Igeret, this particular letter that the Rambam wrote, which is appears in a scholarly edition of the Rambam's works, this letter basically is called Igeret Hashmad, the letter concerning persecution. And it was written as a response to someone who the Rambam felt wrote a very irresponsible answer to a question that had been asked regarding what is the proper behavior for Jewish people who find themselves in a foreign land when they are being persecuted and they are under the threat of forced conversion. What should they do? Should they come to Israel or not? And by the way, it's very interesting that the Rambam indicates in this very letter that he himself fled from what's called shmad, persecution leading to forced conversion from Spain, and that is why he fled in the first place to the land of Israel, and later why he had to continue at that time in history on to Egypt, because the same thing was going on in the land of Israel at that time. But here, the Rambam addresses himself to those people who felt that they should just wait where they are and wait for Mashiach to come. And when Mashiach comes, he will take them to Israel and everything will be fine. And he writes about these people that whoever stays where they are and waits for Mashiach to come in the face of widespread persecution and says that when Mashiach comes, that's when he'll leave, he said such a person is desecrating the name of heaven. And he says it's ridiculous because we don't know exactly when Mashiach is going to come. There is no set time. He says that you could pin everything on him and say it's either a little bit closer or a little bit further. But then he goes and he says something unbelievable, and I wish the whole Jewish world would listen to this statement, because everyone reveres the Rambam as such a tremendous authority. But when it comes to the belief in Mashiach coming, again, it's such a basic, important belief in Hashem's promise that the Redeemer will come, but it has been interpolated, it has been clouded. We have stuck onto it all sorts of notions that are not authentic, original Jewish beliefs. Listen to what the Rambam tells us. He says, the obligation of our faith, of our religion and the mitzvot is not dependent on the arrival of the Mashiach. He says none of the performance of any of the commandments are dependent on the Mashiach for them to be fulfilled, but rather we are constantly obligated to be occupied with the Torah and the mitzvot, and we must endeavor to fulfill their observance. And after we have done what was expected of us, what we were required to do, if Hashem gives us the merits for us, he says, and I'm quoting everything here word for word, he says, if Hashem gives us the merit, or our children, or our grandchildren to see the Mashiach, that's very good. And it's a wonderful thing. And if not, we have not lost anything, but rather we have gained by that we have done exactly what we were obligated to do. And this is such an amazing principle that the Rambam is spelling out here for us in the most direct way, both philosophically and halachically as well. He's telling us a major principle in Jewish thought, that there are no mitzvot that are in any way dependent on the arrival of the Mashiach for their fulfillment. That there are no mitzvot about which we're supposed to wait, that he arrives and says, okay, now it's time for you to fulfill this mitzvah. And if that's the case, we can understand on our own that the Rambam has indicated, how much more so, that there is no mitzvah about which the Mashiach himself is personally obligated to do, since all of the mitzvot were given at Mount Sinai to all of the Jewish people. And obviously, everything which the Rambam tells us in the beginning of chapter 11 regarding all of those things about which the Kesef Mishnah says these are wonderful things to believe, that Mashiach is going to come. These are the things that we're anticipating. But the Kesef Mishnah says, I'm not going to comment on this because that's not my job. I comment on the halachic issues. And of course, later, as the Rambam turns the page and tells us in the 12th chapter, our sages are divided about the scenario of how these things are going to happen, because the prophets deliberately left them shrouded in mystery. And again, because as we learn, so much is dependent on our behavior. And no man knows how they're going to turn out until they turn out. And here, in his beautiful Igeret, his epistle concerning persecution, he tells us none of the commandments are dependent in any way on the arrival of the Mashiach for their fulfillment, but rather all of the mitzvot call out to us now. They all beckon to us for their fulfillment. They are as viable now as they always were, and we are not supposed to wait for the Redeemer to come and tell us that the time has arrived to do this or that mitzvah, and certainly not wait for him to fulfill it for us. And no different is the mitzvah of the Holy Temple, not according to the Rambam, not according to the Holy Torah, the place of the Shekhinah, the light to Israel, and the light to the nations.